The RNC, Joe Rogan, and Canadian truckers. I'm Foday Sillah, and this is The Square Circle. Hello, and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Foday Sillah. Joining us today are Progressive and Executive Director of Repro Action, Erin Matson. Nice to see you again, Ms. Matson.
Good to see you, Foday.
Libertarian and Executive Director of Feminists for Liberty, Kat Murti. Hey,
Thanks
Ms.
for having
Murti.
me on.
And finally, conservative and contributing editor for Newsweek, Peter Roff. Welcome.
How are you? It's good to be here.
This week, the Republican National Committee censured 2 Republicans of Congress for participating in the January 6th commission. Here's a story from CBS News.
The highest-ranking Republican official in the Senate is making his stance clear when it comes to the deadly January 6th attack on the Capitol.
It was a violent insurrection for the purpose of trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power.
Tuesday, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell criticized the Republican National Committee for censuring Wyoming's Liz Cheney and Illinois' Adam Kinzinger for serving on the House Select Committee investigating the insurrection. It was the language of the RNC resolution to censure members of its own party that struck a nerve, stating that Cheney and Kinzinger chose to join Nancy Pelosi in a Democrat-led persecution of ordinary citizens who engaged in legitimate political discourse.
The issue is whether or not the RNC should be sort of singling out members of our party who may have different views from the majority. That's not the job of the RNC.
Okay, so my question for Mr. Roff is, does this mean the Trump faction is still strong with the Republican Party? Since it does seem that there is a bit of a divide, but does he still have a hold in the party itself?
I think it's obvious that he does. I don't think that this RNC resolution, which, as far as I understand, isn't binding on anybody, matters a whole hill of beans in how, let's say, the next campaign cycle develops. It may allow party committees to intervene in primaries on behalf of Liz Cheney's primary opponent. Kitzinger's not running for re-election. The Democrats in Illinois gerrymandered him out of his seat. But I have a lot of respect for Liz Cheney. I like Liz Cheney a lot. I had a problem with her wanting to conduct a crusade against Trump while she was a member of the House Republican leadership, because that's kind of a conflict. There's some guys in the Republicans in the House who are for Trump, some who are against. So she should have stepped down from her leadership post. She didn't. She was voted out. Now she's cooperating with Nancy Pelosi. I don't, in what is not a fair and balanced investigation of what happened on January 6th. It's another effort to get at Trump. There's a lot we should be looking at about what happened on January 6th, including some of the things Nancy Pelosi did. But she's not interested in going there. The reason that this has become such a big story is because it distracts from the Democrats in disarray. That's the real story.
Ms. Matson, I'm going to move the question on to you. You don't seem to, or by the look of your face, you don't seem to agree with what he just said. Do you have anything to say about what he just said?
The Republican National Committee has demonstrated that it is in a complete lockstep with the Trumpers, and to say in this same resolution, it framed what happened on January 6th as, quote, legitimate political discourse, unquote. I want to, again, is it legitimate political discourse to bring in Confederate flags, to break down doors, to attack U.S. Capitol Police officers, to call for the overthrow of an election when we have for hundreds of years been a democracy that relies on the power of elections, when at the same time you had Mike Pence going and speaking at the Federalist Society and saying that Donald Trump was wrong, that he didn't have the power to overturn the election. We are truly in a very scary place as a country. And what happened on January 6th was not legitimate political discourse. It was an attempt to overthrow our government in order to keep someone who had not been democratically reelected in office. And so that's a really big deal. Liz Cheney is not of my political persuasion. I agree with her on really quite very little, but I'll say this much about Liz Cheney. She is a woman of integrity, and it is very impressive that she has held her ground and that she has stood up for the rule of law in spite of this bullying from her party. And I think it's really notable and significant that a number of Republican senators are backing away from what the RNC did. There seems to be quite a large schism among the Republicans where you have some elected officials, even Mitch McConnell, did not speak in favor of the RNC censuring some sitting members of Congress. So it's a big deal. It's a really big deal. And I can understand why a number of these Republican senators would be nervous that this is not the message they want to be sending in critical elections.
Kat, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I do. So first off, I think that this is indicative of larger trends in this country of political polarization and tribalism. And that's what led to the events of January 6th. And I think that that's what we're still seeing here. We've seen over a year of President Biden being in office, and yet we're still focusing on Trump politics, and we're still talking about never Trumpers, and we're still seeing the party split along those lines. And I think that that's actually what you're seeing happen between sitting members of Congress, whether the two who were censured or the ones who have come to stand behind them in the days since. I think what you're really seeing here is a split between this old school view of my colleagues in Congress versus what we see as increasingly this political polarization that we see at the polls that the RNC is sort of reflecting, and that we're also going to see on the left. This is not only on the right that this is happening, but it's all about the culture wars and fighting the other side and, my guy, not the other guy. We're not one team together. And I think that this is a huge problem that is going to be a much bigger problem over time. It's growing, and it's something that we really need to address. This country is splitting in a way that it hasn't since really the Civil War, I think, ideologically. And the fact of the matter is that people don't care about the policies. They don't care about what's actually happening on the ground, how they can help their fellow Americans. What they care about is if you're red versus blue, and that's all that they see. And that's a huge problem.
If you really think, first of all, these people didn't have the power to overthrow the U.S. government. I mean, one of these demonstrators would not have, the guy in the wolf suit would not have ended up the president of the United States if they'd managed to stop the vote counting, which is what I keep hearing every time I hear people talking about this was an attempt to overthrow the government. This was an attempt to stop the counting of the ballots, and it failed. Now, there are a lot of things going on right now. And, one of the things that there were people in Washington that day to participate peacefully and legitimately in the political discourse of the moment. They didn't like the election outcome. They had concerns about how the election was conducted. They had concerns about the constitutionality of some of the rules changes that happened in the states. They came to Washington. They went to a rally. They heard the president. They may have gone home, and now they're being visited by the FBI and having to call attorneys because they showed up in a photograph, or somebody who looked like them showed up in a photograph, or their cell phone pinged from being in Washington, D.C. On that day. And it shocks me that the FBI is being so zealous in hunting down people who were in Washington, D.C. that day, but who may not have been on Capitol Hill, or who may not have gone, or who did not go into the building at any time during any of the events. And that frightens me. And in fact, that frightens me more than what happened on January 6th, because it's one thing when Wolf Suit guy and Confederate flag guy and feet on Pelosi's desk guy do something ridiculously stupid. It's another thing when law enforcement agencies in the US government do things to the rest of us. And then I think we all have to be a little bit concerned.
Well, Peter, you say that it frightens you, and it should frighten you. But the thing is that it's not surprising. The FBI has a long and storied history of targeting people who are in political opposition to the ruling power. And I think that in this case, perhaps there's maybe even more of an argument for them to be involved than in some of the other cases. They've gone after Quakers, they've gone after anti-war protesters, they've gone after the civil rights movement, and this is just a continuation of that. But I do think that you are correct that we need to be very careful that in our political zealotry to oppose those who seem scary to us, that we do not eviscerate our civil rights, because this is a real threat.
That's right. And if you think these guys could overthrow the US government, what chance do we have against the communist Chinese or the Russians?
Also this week, streaming giant Spotify removed some of podcasters Joe Rogan's old content. Here is CNBC with the story.
All right, we got to move on to the latest on the Spotify and Joe Rogan saga. The CEO of Spotify speaking out. What's he saying?
He is, Daniel Ek. He's addressing the latest scandal, which is not the vaccination. It's this video montage of Joe Rogan using racial slurs over the years. So he's addressing that, and Ek writes to staff, while I strongly condemn what Joe has said, and I agree with his decision to remove past episodes from our platform, I realize some will want more, and I want to make one point very clear. I do not believe that silencing Joe is the answer. So that's pretty clear.
That's good.
Spotify will not be canceling Joe Rogan. And they're not. Rogan wanted those episodes removed. 113 of them were. By the way, they were recorded prior to Joe Rogan's deal with Spotify.
And my question for you guys today is, are we overreacting?
You know, people are outraged about Joe Rogan. And I think that disinformation and medical disinformation is an extremely important public health issue. And so, you know, it's not just the COVID denialism and the spreading inaccurate information about COVID, which is really horrific. I mean, people are dying every single day in this country, and we are in a war just for truth. So I think people have every right to be upset about Joe Rogan. You know, when I first saw that Neil Young pulled out of Spotify, I was like, keep on rocking in the free world, dude. That's awesome. That people are exercising their own rights to say they don't want to be involved in this anymore. I know lots of people in my circles, I'm hearing people say, you know, I'm dropping my Spotify subscription. I had been considering moving to a paid subscription myself, and I'm not quite interested. And I also want to note that this is bigger. I mean, more information has come out about Joe Rogan, and specifically, there was a tape revealed where he was using the N-word, and that's just not okay. We could never use that word. And I think it's very important that people understand that this is part of a broader worldview, and people have every right to be upset.
The problem here is that there are certain people out there who think they get to tell everybody else what they can say and what they can think. And we've been warned about this since PC first became an issue. Political correctness first became an issue in the mid-'80s. Orwell warned about this in 1984. You know, I saw Henry Fonda in a film from 1942 saying, you can't tell people what they can say and what they can't say. Not in this country, at least not yet. But there are people who want to dictate what other people can say, and this falls into this. Look, find me a person who hasn't said or written something that they wish they could take back because today it offends somebody, and I will nominate them for president of the United States because they are clearly pure and better than all of the rest of us. I think that this business is nonsensical, especially because it's driving traffic to Joe Rogan on Spotify. And so if the effort here is to sanction Rogan for what he said, to force him off the air, like Jimmy Kimmel was forced off the air on ABC 2 years ago for the summer, it's having the absolute opposite impact. Now, I'm a journalist. I believe in the First Amendment. I believe in the free speech culture beyond the First Amendment, that everybody's got the right to say what they want to say, even if it offends somebody. And the cure for bad speech is more speech, not restrictions. I mean, people are being sanctioned for what they say and what they think. You've got to be prepared to defend your ideas, but nobody's got a right to tell somebody else to go shut up. That's un-American. And I'm going to keep on rocking in the free world because I believe that.
Kat, where do you side in this conversation?
Well, I don't know that I would say that I would side, but I will say that that question in and of itself kind of explains what the big problem is here. This is yet another manifestation of this exact same political polarization problem that I was talking about. Joe Rogan is an entertainer. That's really honestly what he is. He's being put up as a totem of a particular set of political views, or perhaps a part of, again, another culture war pawn. And I think that he's actually used that to some extent to market himself. And I think that he will continue to use that to market himself. I think that, as Peter said, he's probably received a whole lot more traffic this week than in previous weeks, simply because he's been one of the biggest news stories and people are paying attention to that. But he's an entertainer. He doesn't have one specific political view that he's espousing on his show. He's had Bernie Sanders on the show. He's had all sorts of different people. He's had a bunch of conspiracy theorists. I don't know the guy. I don't know what he believes. I'm not sure that it's likely that he believes that all of our politicians are reptiles in suits, but he's had a guy on his show who says that. I haven't listened to the vast majority of Joe Rogan's podcasts. There's over 2,000 of them. And I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of people who are out there talking about Joe Rogan this week haven't either. And that's kind of indicative of the problem. People feel the need to weigh in on these issues as if it's another battle in the culture war. And that's what it's being treated like. And then that's actually causing more of these issues. Now, that said, I do think that it's really not acceptable to say the N-word in all but very few contexts. And I think it's actually fairly easy to avoid doing so. And so to that one point, I do think that if we were simply censoring people on that line alone, we would not have nearly as few people as Peter seems to believe. Now, that said, I don't think that that's the real issue. I think people are looking for issues. They're digging for issues to fight it out. And I think that Joe Rogan is probably going to be the winner of this week's battle in the culture war, because so many more people know who he is now than ever did before. He previously had 11 million subscribers. I'm willing to bet that that number is going to be jumping in the next few weeks.
It's an ongoing protest by Canadian truckers that has reached quite the boiling point. Here's the BBC coverage.
In Canada, thousands of people have been protesting in the capital over COVID rules. Truck drivers are at the centre of this. They've been blocking roads in Ottawa, and the authorities say it's got out of hand. There's now a state of emergency. For the truck drivers, this is about a point of principle.
People should be able to make their own choice if to take the needle or not take the needle, and not lose the job, not lose their house, not lose their income, just for the vaccination.
While the protests continue, they're not new. This actually started last month when Justin Trudeau's government brought in a vaccine mandate for truckers arriving from the US. All Canadian truckers must be vaccinated to avoid a 14-day quarantine. And in protest, a loose coalition of truckers and Conservative groups was formed. and what's been called the Freedom Convoy began making its way from Western Canada to Ottawa. Quickly, it was attracting support from much further afield.
Kat, is the Canadian mandate, outdated?
Absolutely. Absolutely. First off, I will say that mandates are just simply not the best way to pass policy. 80% of Canadians are vaccinated. 90% of Canadian truckers are vaccinated. It certainly seems like a bad time to be instituting vaccine mandates on Canadian truckers or truckers moving goods through the U.S.-Canadian border. And this is also coming at a time when blue states in the U.S. have been lifting mandates for the first time. So this certainly seems a little too much, a little too late. And again, it's these mandates, it's this attempt to use government force to get people to do things that they do not want to do, rather than using the marketplace of ideas that is causing these issues. We wouldn't see this freedom convoy coming about if people were simply trying to talk to their neighbors about why they should be vaccinated, why, if we were having a better campaign to get people to choose vaccines. I think that would be a very different conversation that we would be having. The mandates were instituted, the backers of the mandates have very clearly said that what they wanted to do was make life very difficult for people who chose not to get vaccinated, that they wanted to squish them out of markets, that they wanted to make it difficult for them to exist in the day-to-day world. And when you do that, when you back people into a corner, it's completely understandable that they will respond in this way. And truckers themselves, again, the vast majority of them are vaccinated. They've been told throughout this whole pandemic that they are essential workers. They are essential to our economy. And, all of a sudden they're being told that maybe they're not so essential if they don't choose to bow down to a specific mandate, and they're pushing back against that. And what we're seeing is that maybe they are essential.
I will move on to Ms. Matson. You have anything to say about this topic?
Yeah, well, in fact, these protests have now escalated to a point of disruption that we have a disruption of the market. And in fact, you have, for example, Ford is now unable, they've had to shut down some work in factories because the bridges are being blocked. And it's also notable that that now the Department of Homeland Security is saying that it anticipates that a similar trucker-style protest and shutdown could be coming to the U.S. In fact, possibly going to Los Angeles for the Super Bowl, traveling potentially across the country for State of the Union to Washington, D.C. This is massive disruption. And I want to be very clear that it's somewhat, it's not even somewhat ironic. It's like, it's eyes popping out of your head, ironic that that people who are carrying a mantle of saying that they want less disruption from COVID are in fact disrupting a fragile economy even more, disrupting the means of production, disrupting people's ability to go out and shop and get the things that they need to care for their family when already there's a supply chain nightmare and there's not all the products that people are looking for on grocery store shelves. So I think this is something that could become a very big issue in the United States soon, that could seriously and severely disrupt daily life for people who are in nearby communities.
Thank you. And Mr. Roff?
I think it's awesome. You know what's disruptive? Lockdowns. When the government told everybody, stay home from work, close your business, close your factory, that was disruptive. That crashed a $20 trillion US economy into the floor and through it. That was disruptive. And I think what you have now is a situation in which the rule makers are more concerned about the rules they made being obeyed than they are about being sensible or rational. If you want to talk about COVID disinformation, the first place you ought to go is to Anthony Fauci and the CDC. As we move away from the high point of COVID, we find so much of what they told us was wrong. And so much of what was disruptive about COVID can be laid at the feet of the government, and that's not going to be discussed very much in the future, I'm afraid. And so I'm hoping that these protests continue, like the parents who are protesting here in the United States that they can't send their kids into school without masks on, or if they do, that those kids are isolated in the cafeteria or the gymnasium, and they're not having a daily learning experience. They're experiencing a denial of service. The Johns Hopkins study that came out 2 weeks ago said basically lockdowns were worse than not doing them. That lockdowns were affirmatively bad, and we know that drug use went up, and we know that alcoholism went up, and I'm sure we're going to find other things about how and why lockdowns were harmful. But because the government was behind them, we were all locked into them. And the government is now invested in explaining that masks are still essential, and they're not willing to tolerate dissent. And so you've got the truckers in Canada, and you may have the truckers in DC. And I just say, put the pedal to the metal, and more power to you.
All right. Now let's take some questions from our viewers. Our first question is from Julia Cole. And the question is, do you think that the RNC censure will affect the future of the Republican Party? And I am going to start that with Ms. Matson.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the Republican National Committee is the electoral arm of the Republican Party, and it's shown it's in a great bit of turmoil as it is supporting a white supremacist coup attempt on January 6th that took place, and calling it part of legitimate political discourse at the same time that they have multiple, I should note, very conservative Republican senators coming out against them. So yeah, I mean, this is a critical moment, and the Republican Party clearly has inner work to do within the party.
Mr. Roff?
Nah, tempest in a teapot. It blows over in a week or two. People will forget. They'll move on to something else. Again, this is about distracting from the disarray in the Democratic Party.
I think it's a chicken and egg thing. It's more that this is foretelling the future of the Republican Party. I think the RNC is representative of what the Republican Party is becoming and is now, which is very much a party of being anti-left, even if the policies that they might support, such as tariffs, are actually quite leftist economic policies. And I think that we're seeing a split from what might have been viewed as the party of small government, though I would argue they usually aren't that small government, but the party of small government or the party of free markets is increasingly becoming the party of anything that the Democrats do is bad.
And the next question we have is from Virginia Manning. And the question is, will Spotify fire Joe Rogan?
No, I think if they were going to, they would have already. But I do think the more interesting question is, how many more artists may leave Spotify? And time will tell.
Mr. Ralph?
Nothing to add to what Erin said. I think she's got it spot on.
Kat?
I think this is one in which we're all in agreement. Spotify's CEO has already said that they're not going to fire Joe Rogan. I think this is just a matter of seeing how the markets even themselves out. We've seen Spotify's stock price crash in the last week following this conversation with Joe Rogan. As Peter and I both mentioned, we both suspect that Joe Rogan's listenership will actually be going up following this controversy. On the other hand, many artists are choosing to leave the platform. It'll be interesting to see how things settle out.
Okay, that's always exciting to see all of us agreeing to everything. Now it's time for the most underrated story of the week. Who'd like to go first?
I will go. I feel like the buzzword that I've been using this whole episode has been culture wars, culture wars, culture wars, culture wars. And I think because of the focus on topics like that, we're missing a big story. And that is that inflation is at a 40-year high right now. It's at 7.5% up year over year since last month. This is a huge deal. The value of the dollar is down. We're facing shrinkflation. So it's not just that your dollar itself is shrinking in value, but we're getting, but the products themselves, you go to the grocery store, the jars are slightly smaller. Your granola bar is just about like a 1/4 inch tinier, just in these little ways that you don't notice. You have less customer service. And this is something that should be uniting all Americans. We are all getting poorer by the minute, and this is a serious problem. This is going to be impacting us worse and worse and worse. I think that we're going to be facing potentially another housing bubble as a result of this in the next year or two. And, you know, this is something that Americans should be very focused on. And yet we've been distracted by all of these culture war issues. This is just something that's not happening. And our elected representatives, the people who are supposed to be helping us out in government, are instead spending money like it's going out of style and shutting down the economy with lockdowns and tariffs and other measures that are going to be making the problems worse. We're already facing empty shelves in the grocery stores. We're already looking at people just not being able to get by on the money that they're bringing home in every paycheck, and it's just going to keep getting worse. There's right now, it's not looking like inflation will be turning around anytime soon. And this is something that really does hurt every single one of us. And this is something that we should actually be focused on instead of all of these other issues that are actually making headlines and that the politicians want us to think about instead of what they should actually be working on.
Mr. Roff?
Why the underreported story of the week is former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo sounding like he's a future candidate for something. He gave an interview in which he said that if he had to do it again, under the same circumstances, he wouldn't have resigned the governorship. He's making noises about perhaps challenging Letitia James, the attorney general who took him down, in the upcoming Democratic primary. And he's got $18 million in his war chest, which means he is the best funded Democrat in the state right now. I think this is a huge story. I think Cuomo should have been thrown out of office, but not because he was a groper. I think he should have been thrown out of office because he was the murderer, a serial murderer of elderly people, whose policies that he enforced infected them with COVID. Going out of town on the groping stuff sort of pushes that into the background. And so I'm hoping that there'll be a little bit more attention paid in the next week or two to Mr. Cuomo's COVID record, so we can put an end to the Cuomo dynasty once and for all.
And I'm going to end it with Ms. Matson.
Yeah, a serious issue that the National Archives is now asking the Department of Justice to look into the Trump administration, literally Donald Trump as president, the wanton destruction of documents in total violation of the Presidential Records Act. And this is a very serious thing. And it's becoming clear that this was a long history and pattern, that this wasn't simply about documents related to January 6th or the election, but that throughout the presidency, that documents that belong to the people were being destroyed. And it's quite serious. So I hope that we get that there is in fact an investigation. My concern is there's been reporting that there isn't much in the way of an enforcement mechanism. Does this become the new normal, that others begin to destroy government documents while holding positions? So it's a very serious story.
Thank you.
If he'd only set up a private email server.
That's all we have time for. Thanks to our guest, and thank you for watching and listening to The Square Circle. I'm Foday Sillah. You've watched the entire show, so why not hit that subscribe button, maybe like the video, you're listening to a podcast, give us 5 stars, and I'll see you next week.